Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second Sunday Showdown. Let me get our guests in here. Brilliant. Like that. Perfect. I like this one. Okay, so how's this going to go down? So for those who are new, the Sunday Showdown is an experimental debate show that I host where we try to get small but serious channels to debate serious topics with the aim of promoting more serious levels of discourse as well as mutual growth between participants. If you think that you or someone you know would like to participate in a future Sunday Showdown, message me on Twitter or Discord and we can have a chat. Okay, so today we are watching ThoughtBat and fellow traveler debate whether a market or a planned economy is preferable. A quick word about format before we begin. Each debater will get 8 minutes to give their opening statement. I will alert you when you pass 5 and then cut you dead when you hit 8. There will then be 2 sets of alternating 5-minute responses followed by 25 minutes of open discussion, concluding with 20 minutes of audience questions. In the interest of time, Super Chat questions will be prioritized, followed by the remainder in chronological order as they are posted. I do ask that if you're going to ask a non-Super Chat question, that you mark it with an asterisk on both sides so that I can easily find it in the chat. And then finally, be aware that there will be zero tolerance for the use of slurs or abusive language, either by our guests or in the chat or towards either. Behave well or be elsewhere. I give my mods full discretion to ban at will. So much for format. We will flip a coin to see who begins. ThoughtBat, you will be heads. Fellow Traveler will be tails. I trust there are no objections. Heads. So, ThoughtBat, you're going to take the floor to begin. You have 8 minutes. Go.
Hello, and thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about this on this platform. If you're familiar at all with my channel, as small as it is, its main objective is to try and engage in productive dialogue with parts of the left which are in opposition to my own values and views in an attempt to gain a better understanding of each other's ideas and perspectives. I think this is important because 1, we are seeking to address the same problem and we are advocating on behalf of the same demographics, and 2, so that we can have a clearer understanding of when we should or shouldn't collaborate when organizing ourselves against threats or antagonists of said demographics. Today or tonight, depending where you are in the world, I'll be arguing in favour of what I would call market socialism against planned economies. For this debate, I've given myself 3 objectives. 1, make my ethical case for property rights, from which the logical conclusion is a rejection of capitalism. 2, to highlight the distinctions between market socialism and capitalism, which makes the former a legitimate alternative economic model for which anti-capitalists should investigate. And 3, give a critique of planned economies, which my opponent advocates for, in order to dissuade anti-capitalists from an economic model which I consider to negate certain ethical considerations based on which I arrive at an anti-capitalist conclusion in the first place. I should first clarify that I do not arrive at my conclusions from a Marxian analysis of capitalism, nor from a consequentialist model of ethics. As far as ethics is concerned, I am an egoist. One has no obligation to serve the interests of any other person or idea. Instead, we act according to our own value judgments, and thus we engage in the pursuit of a life worth living according to our own personal standards. This take is the bedrock, if you will, of my political advocations. With that being said, I will now conduct my analysis on property rights. From which in time economic models are necessarily built, as economic models are effectively determined by the question of who owns what. It seems to me that property, being the exclusive right to access, use, and alienate an object or concept, is justified and even necessitated by the need for a person to manipulate objects around them in order to continue living. For example, food. If I had no right to own food, then I have no intellectual tool to prevent someone from taking the food out of my hand before it reaches my mouth. I can be given food by someone, you can put it on my plate, but I have no right to do anything with it without the personal right to own food. A similar instance would be housing. If I'm not afforded exclusive access to a particular house, then there's no ethical justification to prevent me from being displaced from my house by some other person or authority. So it seems that property is then justified based on use and not so much based on ancestral titles or even purchase. So what about a workplace? Who has the right to own that? My conclusion is that the justification for use of property rights don't scale up to absentee property, property which is owned by a owner who does not use that property. So we must ask, who is using the resources? As we know, a company is only made profitable by the manipulation or potential manipulation of resources to create a commodity. The absentee owner is not needed to produce a commodity. So as far as my justification is concerned, the absentee owner has no business owning the property, but the users do. The users of capital, i.e. the labourers, therefore have the right to work land and resources independently, and thus ushering in a new and genuine type of free competition. The combination of those two words, free and competition, is disturbing to the ears of many on the left due to its links with capitalism. However, capitalism finds itself impossible to facilitate free competition, as it definitionally rests on the domination of land and capital in the form of absentee property deeds. Workers are certainly free to compete with each other, and to some extent, capitalists are free to compete with other capitalists. However, the labouring class cannot freely compete with the owning class because they are denied access to the means of production and the full product of their labour via the most aggressive uses of force the liberal state can get away with. Now that workers are free to organise themselves and their work, I would look forward to seeing a breathtaking variety of models and structures within which labourers work within. I consider myself to be somewhat of a pan-anarchist, or an anarchist without objectives, as many anarchists have their own reasonable and legitimate goals, and there are many more valid methods of achieving these goals. We see in anarchist societies across the world, past and present, a diversity of mediums for resource distribution, all coexisting and competing
3 minutes left.
Only to convince people that one of these models is best suits their unique character and interests. Across the Free Territory of Ukraine, for example, there existed communes in some areas where resources were distributed from each according to their ability to each according to their need. And as other areas, we saw commodities be produced and sold via cooperative enterprise. Even in smaller communes like Christiania in Copenhagen, which I've personally visited, markets still exist and function within them alongside mutual aid networks in order to improve the area's quality of living. These models resulting from free experimentation are incredibly diverse, yet united on the basis of voluntary participation and the absence of absentee property rights. Because such a model promotes and necessitates worker ownership and the means of production, this model of resource distribution is indeed a form of socialism. As markets also exist in such a model, we have market socialism. The differences which I've laid out between this and capitalism are significant enough to attract the support of anti-capitalists who are disillusioned by the idea of vanguardism and central planning. Speaking of such, my primary objection to the idea of central planning is going to be with the ultimate negation of worker autonomy. The transferal of all economic power into the hands of a select few technocrats, even if such a practice was fully democratic, this disempowerment of the individual worker would be immense, as now the control they have over the labour's product would be reduced to be 1 over 30 million on the island of Britain alone. The more centralised that democratic power structure is, the less of a say each person has on its results. Such a technocracy or centralised democracy will certainly negate the use of property rights I appealed to earlier, as the considerations and interests of each worker in each workplace cannot truly be represented in such central planning. The idea of a state assuming and, let's be frank, imposing its responsibility to regulate the economy fails to meet my standards of a legitimate median of resource distribution. This problem necessitates the discussion of fundamental ethical principles such as property and the right to workplace autonomy, and I look forward to engaging in that discussion. I yield the rest of my time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Let me just reset the timer here. And fellow traveler.
Am I ready to go?
You are ready to go in 3, 2, 1, now.
Hello, my name is Fellow Traveler. I run a YouTube channel, and today I shall be making my case for a socialist planned economy, more specifically what I'd like to call a steady state cybernetic socialist planned economy. Steady state in the sense that production is geared away from the growth ethic and towards meeting human need while sustaining a balanced load with our habitat. Cybernetic in the economic calculation would be done in real time utilizing a combination of linear programming, computers, and IT. Socialist in the sense that the means of production are publicly owned and ran towards a common good, and planned in the sense that resource harvesting, production, consumption, and distribution are done according to a rational plan. The reason why I'm in favor of such a model is because I have been convinced with positive evidence that under such a system, we can achieve the most rational allocation of resources, maximize efficiency, achieve greater levels of political and individual freedom, and meet all human need while maintaining a balanced load with our habitat. And the reason for this is because the system I advocate wouldn't be based on the profit motive, and distribution would be done according to need rather than market demand. Inputs would be taken from average labor times needed to manufacture consumer goods, as well as the services needed to reproduce civilization. And output targets would be set according to demand feedback taken from control systems. Goods would be produced as use values and distributed according to need. or at least according to work in the earlier stages. In a market system, firms are provided pricing information according to market signals. And while this rationale proves a basis for economic activity, there is a great deal of needless turbulence that occurs in the wake of it, since the market distributes resources according to demand and profitability, not according to need. This is how we get starving artists whose paintings get sold for millions of dollars after their death. This is how we end up with stock market panics, which lead to overproduction cycles, forcing firms to dump surplus commodities and fire their workers. This is how we end up in situations like we are here in America, where we have 6 empty homes for each homeless person, 40,000 dead per year from preventable illness due to a lack of access to healthcare services, etc. It is in this way, because markets are a profit-driven system and not a needs-driven system, that we end up with economic turbulence in the form of unemployment, poverty, wasted labor and resources, and wealth consolidation. What is rational to the market is not necessarily rational according to a technical or ecological standpoint. All one has to do is look at the seas of landfills, climate change, global hunger, and environmental degradation to see this phenomenon in action. There's a concept in physics known as the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution. When you have a closed system full of gas particles, the particles will bounce off one another as well as the walls of the tank. In each encounter, the particles exchange energy with one another, and between each interaction, energy is conserved. Over time, through the random interactions between gas particles in the tank, there will be a propensity for a small minority of particles to have gathered a great majority of the energy, and for a great majority of the particles to share a minority of the energy between them. Russian physicist Yakovenko observed this phenomenon. This distribution of energy between particles is highly analogous with the way that individuals within a market exchange money and goods between one another, and that in general, the long-term result is growing inequality. Under a co-op market economy, such a trend would inevitably emerge, since the same market mechanisms and logic reign supreme. The priority of the system is still profits and private enrichment, not production and distribution according to a common rational plan. Need I remind my audience that there are other means of exploitation outside of the dynamic between wage labor and capital. Larger cooperatives could simply give out loans to smaller cooperatives at an accrued interest rate, or they could rent out their goods and services, or they could outsource their labor. These are just a few ideas. The long-term effects of such a system would be the emergence of a labor aristocracy, where the top 10% of cooperatives are extremely wealthy, and the bottom 90% of cooperatives are either bankrupt or struggling to get by. Under such a system, you would not be able to guarantee full employment. You would still see economic turbulence in the form of boom-bust cycles. You would see growing inequality. You would see the propensity for cooperatives to externalize their operational costs in order to save money. And lastly, in the long term, you would see mounting pressure from above to restore capitalist economic relations, since a system of private ownership is a superior system for profit and accumulation for its own sake. However, under a socialist planned economy, such economic turbulence, unemployment, poverty, and gross inequality could be eliminated since the system is not bound by the laws of motion of capital, the pressures of the market, and the endless drive towards profit. You could actually have a system of rational resource allocation, maximizing the use value of every atom of ore, lumber, and fertile soil on this planet. Hell, you could actually have a system where the public knows exactly how much we have of resource X, what we need to produce resource Y, and when exactly there's going to be a shortage of use value Z. You could establish a system where the governance over people can eventually be replaced by the administration of things. A system where the load on our global earthly habitat is taken into account with respect to economic plan. A system which actually seeks to maximize the potential of everyone and everything. I'm going to finish this by posing a number of questions to my opponent. You may answer them during your rebuttal, or you may answer them during our back and forth, but sooner or later, I would like some answers. From what I understand, you are an anarchist, but without a state, how do you keep industrial cooperatives from dumping toxic lead into a water supply in order to save money? How do you hope to circumvent the economic turbulence associated with the market economy? How do you expect to sustain full employment when people's labor prospects are left up to whether or not their cooperatives can compete and turn a profit? If outsourcing and interest are as business practices are prohibited without a state, how do you keep the larger cooperatives from engaging in such exploitative practices? Will everyone in the syndicates and communes simply be expected to adhere to some sort of code of conduct? How do you enforce such a thing? What if a neighboring commune decides to sell off their industry to private owners for a fast buck and they start operating identical to traditional private firms? If ThoughtBat agrees with me that the profit motive should not be the guiding prime directive of an economy, then we are about to agree on a lot more than not. And if that's the case, I suggest he consider looking into modern socialist calculation and economics. That is all.
Thank you very much. And so now you'll both get alternating 5-minute blocks to respond to each other. ThoughtBat, I'm going to let you go first, and just give me 5 seconds here to reset the stopwatch. And ready to go?
Okay, so I think I'll address the questions in the back and forth because I think I'd like to address a specific part of Traveller's opening statement, which is about cooperatives and how similar they may behave to capitalist enterprise. The basic psychology of capitalism has not remained intact because the owners of the company are no longer dealing with the contradiction between profit and wage. There's no personal incentive for elected managers to take home the value of labourers, similar to any incentive shared by the shareholders of capitalist firms. There's no contradiction between the interests and the other workers and the competitive edge of the company, as the company needs to remain competitive in order for the workers to take home the wage. A way for cooperatives to be competitive is actually embedded in the reason why cooperatives are more productive than capitalist firms in the first place. Improving the living conditions of the employees has massive impact on their productivity. An impoverished and overworked and thus demoralized labourer is obviously not going to be as productive as one who has a more comfortable set of living conditions, has fewer work hours, and is generally happier with their life and work. Cooperatives who overwork and underpay their workers will not only be unpopular places to work, but will be under market pressures to increase the quality of life for its employees, for the reasons just given. Further, larger cooperatives have personal incentives to help improve the communities as a whole in which they are based, as their owners live within them, unlike the owners of large capitalist firms who live as far away from possible from working class communities. We see today that cooperatives are by far more proactive in delivering mutual aid to their communities by helping fund schools, public libraries, youth clubs, sports, etc. All of this contributes to an objectively healthier place to live for the members of the cooperative. The difference in the basic psychology between capitalist firms and cooperatives is why we should not predict how cooperatives would treat their communities and employees based on what capitalists do. We've got some concerns about a potential outsourcing and stuff, but I ask, how could a cooperative outsource its labour in an economy without private property? Do you mean buying resources from other cooperatives? It'll be up to those cooperatives to negotiate a price for their product, knowing that other buyers exist and can offer a better deal, with all parties understanding the principle that better off workers are generally more productive? Or do you mean owning workplaces and not allowing the workers in such a workplace to have a say in the company overall? In that case, it's simply absentee ownership and it must be abolished. You mentioned about the labour aristocracy, where a small sector of the working class have the higher wages, maybe supplemented by smaller co-ops. Like I said above, the fact these subsidiary companies exist or are non-cooperatively owned is not compatible with a mutualist or socialist economy. The abolition of private property would mean that these subsidiary companies must be cooperatively owned by the workers, and as such, if they are part of maybe the Mondragon Corporation, for example, they must have voting rights in the running of the federation. This likely happens because the majority of workers at Mondragon are not committed to ideological market socialists. They're not committed to ideological market socialists or mutualists, but people who just like the idea of voting for a manager and see no problem with having capitalist companies supplement their wages. Point about loans. Loans are understood by mutualists to be loans are understood by mutualists and anti-capitalist marketeers as an illegitimate extraction of value. In place of the traditional banking system, we advocate mutual banking, such as credit unions or mutual savings banks, whereby interest is restricted so that it only covers administration fees. Banks have a monopoly on credit, just as capitalists have a monopoly on the means of production and landlords have a monopoly on land. Banks are essentially creating money by lending out deposits that do not actually belong to them and then charging interest on the difference. That's me done.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So you still have 1 more minute left. You don't want to make use of that, or?
I yield my time.
Okay, fair enough. Fellow traveler, go.
Okay, so A couple of things. I want to say something about his opening statements. When he talks about arguing for his system from a ethical standpoint, the reason why I generally try to stay away from arguing in favor of socialism from a moral or ethics standpoint is because I feel like there are more convincing ways to sell people on it, and I think a better way to do it would be to appeal to people's material interests, showcase the pragmatic. How it's a pragmatic solution, how it's more efficient. Because think about it, people are in favor of the current system because they think it's the best and only way to organize our economy. And you can try to convince them through morals, but the only people that are really going to be convinced by that are people that are already sympathetic to you. It's better to showcase how your system is better, how it's more efficient, and why it could offer them a better way of life. But anyways, Another point. So we talked about there being no contradictions between the interests of workers and that the cooperatives would improve living standards. And I think you mentioned the self-exploitation thing. Well, in order to generate revenue or tax revenue, to an extent, there would need to be some degree of social surplus extraction for like the common fund and so on. You couldn't just give people the full proceeds of their labor, or else you're going to have less proceeds for tax revenue, social security, reinvestment, and so on. And allow me to bring up an anecdote of this, an interesting anecdote. I want to talk a little bit about Yugoslavia briefly. Yugoslavia is a very close example to actually existing market socialism. They had a decentral economy, worker self-management, and so on. Well, they had rising unemployment, and they did have some degree of turbulence. And why was that? Because the cooperatives, because they didn't want to exploit themselves for reinvestment, or expanding their business activities, there ended up being an incentive for them basically not to hire more people, and rather than take on more workers and hire more people, you can just pocket the surplus and have higher wages. And unemployment was a growing problem in Yugoslavia, as well as like the aforementioned economic turbulence that was going on. And so much so that by the 1980s, they had over 20% unemployment. And next thing, on the whole point of cooperatives outsourcing, richer cooperatives would have more economic leverage over the poorer ones since they possess more capital and they have more economic sway. So they would have greater competitive advantage. And in a competitive co-op economy or market economy, they're one of the more established shows in town. There would be a more established show. So I'm glad he brought up Mondragon, because Mondragon outsources about a third of their labor force. And I mean, you can look this up on Wikipedia, but roughly a third of their labor force isn't even officially a part of the company. They're outsourced to second and third world countries, and of course, subsidiary countries that he mentioned. And they only receive like a fraction of the wages and benefits. So yeah, there's no direct exploitation between wage labor and capital, but within such a context, you would still be able to exploit the members of the smaller, lower co-ops, because fundamentally the profit motive is still at the heart of all of this, and there is still a direct material incentive to engage in these behaviors in the first place. And that when we look at the real world, it's not really ethics that drives human behavior, but really their own material interests. And the last point on the mutual banks, I don't really know how you would go about handling something like that, but with mutual banks, how does a bank make money? They loan out and load the creditors on debt. Banks give out loans. Loans come with interest. Interest creates debt. And right there, I mean, unless it's like a national bank or a state-funded bank, you already have a form of exploitation that could exist right there, just through the interest process. So through this, you would inevitably see unemployment, economic turbulence, and the consolidation of wealth. It might be slower. It might be much slower. Left. It might be a slower trend, but inevitably you would see this, because underlying all of this are still a lot of the same ethics that you find in traditional capitalism. So I'm good. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you. So ThoughtBat, you now get 5 minutes to respond.
What should I respond to first? I think the ethical part. So as far as the ethics is concerned, and say, oh well, we should base it on material interests. As an egoist, my ethics is based on material interests, as in we decide societies and we advocate certain things based on the appeal to mutual self-interest. Now, you say we shouldn't really consider the moral arguments for it, but I don't understand why that is the case. Because if we say, right, okay, let's be communists, let's support communism, let's support this particular model, and I ask why, as soon as we go into the why, we're talking about ethics. That's all that is. Because if there's no ethical reason to support a thing, then there's no reason to support the thing at all. So that's that. I've actually forgotten the other point, so I'm going to give more time.
Okay. If you want to take another couple of minutes, because you still have like 4 minutes left. So after Trav goes, if you want to. Okay,
would you like me to just reiterate and re-summarize them for you, so you have something to go off of?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So all I was saying is that both in theory and in practice, we have seen turbulence, the trend towards inequality, as well as unemployment occur within actually the closest thing you could consider like basically a co-op market economy, which is why I brought up the anecdote of Yugoslavia and Mondragon. So yeah, turbulence, growing inequality, and unemployment, because the growth ethic and the drive to private enrichment still underlies the basic motives and incentives of the system. Is a general summary of what I'm talking about.
I'd say it doesn't, because, as I said before, there's no longer a difference between the owners and the workers, and so therefore the workers actually live in the communities in which they are based. So therefore they do have immediate incentives to go ahead and improve their communities, as worker cooperatives do quite a lot. I don't, again, like I said before, I'm not exactly saying every single mode of resource distribution will be done through cooperatives. I think there's going to be non-market factors within a quote-unquote market economy, as in these mutual aid networks. If we go back to, I forgot the actual argument you said about the banks.
Okay, well, I think what we'll do, guys, is we're just going to go straight into the back and forth. So that's how this sort of evolved naturally, anyways. So we'll have 30 minutes of back and forth, and people in the audience, if you want to ask questions, please either, if you're not super chatting them, obviously, those will go first. If you're not, put them in asterisks, and we'll try and answer as many of them as possible. There will be a 20-minute question period after the open discussion. All right, gentlemen, as you were.
Okay.
All right. I mean, go ahead. Like, if you have any interjections, let's just go one topic at a time. So let's talk about unemployment. Under a mutualist economy, how would you be able to protect under such a thing? Because under socialist planning, you could guarantee people employment. You could have an enshrined right in the Constitution, and whenever you approach an output target with respect to XYZ industry, you would be able to redirect labor or remunerate people for increases in productivity, and provide like a direct incentive to do more and more for less and less. What I'm curious to hear about is how exactly would you circumvent unemployment in a co-op market economy? Just curious.
Well, how would I do it? I wouldn't be doing it. It's basically done by free individuals acting within the market, isn't it? But so with the abolition of private property comes with a much greater access to capital from the general working class. So it's easier for people who are interested in. It is easier for people who are interested in starting up a cooperative or joining some kind of, any kind of trade, to have access to that capital. As in, it is no longer being denied by the working class, by the capitalist class, through absentee property rights.
But the cooperatives individually could, since it's their collective property and they have the right to hire and fire who they see fit. Let's say that a contingent of cooperatives see it in their interest to hire fewer people because they don't want to spend the extra money to expand their business because they're all comfortable making the money that they are. And to take on more people would mean that they would have to give up a share of the surplus for that extra worker, and that proportionally they would be able to take more money home if they were to hire fewer people than greater people. So what could be done in such a situation?
Do you think the people living in working at worker cooperatives benefit from incredibly high levels of unemployment around them?
Well, I mean, if they can make more money and secure a greater amount of market share for themselves, I would say so.
How could they make more money if people around them are unemployed?
That is an excellent question. They would inevitably have to hire people, but the main point that I'm getting at is because this incentive is even a thing in the first place, that you wouldn't be able to guarantee full employment because jobs wouldn't they wouldn't be an inherent right that you could enforce, or it would just be left up to whether or not the cooperatives see fit to hire and fire people and so on, basically. So, and the reason why I bring this point up is because, again, in Yugoslavia, this was a growing trend. They had a growing trend of unemployment because many of these cooperatives saw it in their best interest to hire fewer people so that they could take more money home for themselves. And like this has happened in the real world. So my question is, what are some ways to circumvent this hypothetically?
So I'm not all too familiar with the Yugoslavia economy. I know that it is held up as being one of the market socialist ones. Because it's not a mutualist one, I'm not really looking into it that deeply. I did say in one of my videos I would, but I just haven't got around to it yet.
I highly recommend it because it's the closest thing we have to actually existing market socialism. And it'll give you a better idea of what the contradictions were as to how to address them within your ideal economic mode, you see. So yeah, the main point that I'm trying to get at is because the profit motive is still intact, because there's still self-interest, and you have people that are just driving to produce things in pursuit of exchange value and produce use values in pursuit of exchange value, because you still have that modus operandi in place. I mean, even if people have the best intentions in mind, there's still going to be a propensity towards some of the same lingering contradictions that you see within capitalism. You would not be able to guarantee full employment under such an economy because there would be periods where it's more profitable to hire fewer people, basically, booms and busts.
Yeah, I don't advocate it. I wouldn't advocate the guarantee of full employment because that would pretty much violate voluntary association. So it's not something I think anyone should be saying, right, okay, we're going to guarantee full employment. Unemployment will exist. Unemployment can be mitigated through the problems related to unemployment will likely be mitigated through mutual labour networks, which cooperatives do and often participate in because they do have direct incentives to uplift their communities that they live in because they are not isolated from said communities. But it's still all down to free and voluntary cooperation, and I think these things are these are my principles.
I gotcha. So I don't know where to go with this. All right. So I mean, I guess this makes this a little bit easier. Do you understand why I'm in favor of full employment, though? Like why I think that everyone who can work should be going to work. And I mean, you can obviously some people who are incapacitated or pregnant women, or the elderly, we should have like a pension or a common fund for them. But otherwise, everyone who's capable of working should be working because I mean, it's more efficient. Like you can create more abundance and like develop like output more resources so that, we do the work now, we increase productivity now and drive towards more labor efficiency so that we can go on to perpetually shorten the work weeks and eventually get to a point to where we're advanced to where, the average person only needs to do a couple hours of work per week to maintain the upkeep of the system. They're now chores. They're no longer a job. But in the time being, because we're not productive enough, we need everybody working who can work, working. Plus, there's a lot of things like when it comes to unemployment, that just creates unemployed people because they're bored and because they don't really have much going on for themselves, do have a propensity towards more negative health lifestyle habits like drug abuse, alcoholism, and well, I feel like if everybody had the ability to work, it might help circumvent some of the bad habits that people develop while they're unemployed. So I don't know.
Yeah, but we can intervene in those situations if someone is alcoholic to the point where it's no longer within their control, or participating in other bad habits, which we acknowledge that they haven't, that they have no longer sort of in control of their own selves. Then we can intervene on those levels, at those opportunities.
Do you think? Oh, sorry. Go on. I've been asking you plenty of questions. I mean,
how would so? Okay, you've said we're going to have full employment because it's more efficient.
Yeah.
Who controls labor in that case?
Well, I mean, the state would be employing people. You'd have the Ministry of Labor, who basically they would decide where labor gets directed, what projects are going on, and of course, yeah. Basically, that's it. Everyone works for one giant entity, and this giant entity, which is representative of the working class in and of itself, is basically planning and allocating resources and labor and what goes to where and who does what. And the idea is that you have this system as democratic as possible so that people have direct say in like what projects are working on, feedback from below, as well as you have people chosen for administrative and governmental positions at random directly from the working class. You know, that's just the general idea of what my vision is, basically.
At random?
Yeah, at random. It's called sortition democracy. The idea is you have a position, and in order to get qualified for this position, you have to go through some training. After you get your training done, your name is now added to a list of people that will be drawn upon for whenever the last person's term was up and it's not time for a new person to serve a term. That way, everyone has an equal chance to gain leadership skills. Everyone has an equal chance to get elected to that position. And it's people that are chosen directly from the working class. And the greatest benefits of this is it's actually a really good way to circumvent corruption because there's no bribery. There's no reason to like try and tell people what they want to hear in order to get their votes. So there's no incentive for opportunism. It gives everyone an equal opportunity to get in that position. And at the same time, it prevents a bureaucracy from forming with its own separate interests, similar to what happened in the USSR.
Oh, so in that case, you're not in favour of the state bureaucracy as it was in the USSR?
No, it's actually
that's not the model you're advocating for. Yeah,
well, the problem with the Soviets is they tried to use the bureaucracy to circumvent the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy was kind of an inevitability. I mean, for a litany of factors. I mean, I said I wasn't going to bring up the USSR, but yeah, no, less bureaucracy, the more democracy, the better is what I'm looking for.
Would that include workplace democracy?
Yeah. What's up?
Would that include workplace democracy?
Yeah, of course. You'd have managers picked for, directly from the councils and groups of workers. You'd have workers that would have bargaining power and so on. And I think there should be a balance between power between the higher governing bodies as well as like the lower level like workplaces. I do think that workers' autonomy is important, but I do think that the central government, under certain circumstances, should be able to overrule it when it pragmatically makes sense, basically.
Okay, so it's not really worker autonomy then, is it? It's state autonomy.
Well, the state from the top to bottom is nothing but workers or elected administrators and representatives from bodies of workers. So it's a proletarian democracy, basically.
But if you've got a country the size of the United States, so that's roughly 300 million people, 150, is it 150 million voting people who would vote normally? I don't know what the stats are on that.
Roughly.
So when I say before, the more people you have in a centralized democracy, the less of an impact your votes has. Effectively, if you go into a situation So if you go into a country where the thing's mainly run by the state, okay, it's a quote unquote worker state, but you've got 1/50 millionth of a say and how the things run.
Well, you've cracked the code. That's the whole point of a democracy. It's the majority imposing its will on the minority. Now, I do think there should be legal protections for like minorities, but the goal should be to realize the most satisfying outcome for as many people as possible. But yeah, I mean, that's the general idea of a democracy.
Well, not entirely, because if we see, what is democracy just voting?
I mean, it's more than just voting. I mean, it's
What is it then?
well, democracy means rule of the people, or like the governance of the people by the people, like demokrates. It's an old Greek word, and that's the reason why I think wherever direct voting initiatives should be available, they should be. At the same time, people should have equal economic rights as well as equal political rights. And I feel like if you have a system that directly and rationally plans for such a context and has that taken into account, you could definitely achieve this. You could definitely realize the most positive outcomes for as many people as possible is the idea.
So that is your ethical goal.
Yeah, I mean that's one of my goals. Yeah, it is an ethical goal. Is ultimately it's democracy, freedom, basically.
Oh, I don't know about freedom, but so I don't know which avenue to go.
I got one. So let me go ahead and throw a general critique I have with anarchism and anarchy in general. All right. The issue I have with anarchism as an ideology is that its very nature actually appeals to peasant psychology. And I'm not saying this as an insult, but back in like the 1800s, when it came to the demographics who supported whatever ideology, you'll actually find that when there was a peasantry from the Neurotics and so on, that anarchism as an ideology was much more appealing to them. It's freedom of property within the context of feudalism, combined with freedom from property within the context of capitalism. Ultimately, what I don't like about anarchism is it puts the will of the individual like above the will of the majority, and the individual will and what this individual or the small group wants is more important than what the entire group wants or what's best for the entire group. You know, so it's in this mind. It's kind of a so it's in this way that anarchist ideology is kind of a petty bourgeois deviation, and that's the reason why I really don't like it, because I don't really see how you can realize a true democracy when minority groups have more rights and more say, and what they want on an individual basis is more important than what's either best for the group as a whole or what the group wants as a whole. You see what I'm saying?
Okay, but I think the main point about the what you described sounds nothing like anarchy. The way you've got a small group of people pretty much dictating how the thing operates. That's quite the opposite of what anarchists propose.
Well, they want it on an individual basis. Like anarchists are in favor of small cells or federated groups cobbled away, or not, rather than consolidated together, to just broken up into a series of individual local like communes, I guess, syndicates, like local municipalities with I guess like a federated government, more flatline federated government. I'm not saying autonomy for individual communes and syndicates isn't important. It should be taken into account, but I think that, you know, the country's need to combat climate change or fight a war should be prioritized over this commune's desire to produce fidget spinners rather than use blast furnaces or whatever because it's more profitable. Like you see what contradictions I'm talking about now. Sometimes there's higher order things that need to be prioritized first over what people want in like this individual spot, you know?
Yeah, that's fine. So, in terms of yes, we're big fans of voluntary association and obviously cooperation. So the analyst's critique of the state is that it is necessarily coercive and it necessarily violates the rights, the inherent rights of, not necessarily inherent, but I think the legitimate rights of many people. Well, all the people, because in order to be a monopoly on force, you need to be able to assert your will over a given territory. So, with all that being said, this is why I kind of say we can't have a worker state, as in the state, i.e., the collective of people who are in governmental positions. They impose their authority onto the people working within that country. So we can have as much. I get what was the specific democracy you called it? It was
Ministry of Labor. Like what were you looking for?
We could have as much of that as we want, but at the end of the day, it's not really the workers in control of their own labour anymore. That's the critique of capitalism that we have, as in the workers have no control of their own labour, they have no control of their own workspaces. Usufruct property is being violated. So that's kind of where I don't believe in consequentialism, where we'll have, as long as it's benefiting the most people, we'll do pretty much whatever, and make sure that we're efficient as possible, and we'll make sure that we get this and this, all this other stuff ticked off. I'm just not on. I just don't agree with that ethic.
All right. Well, let me give an example of what I'm talking about. So, would you say that this is going to sound really extreme, but would you say that you would agree that murder is wrong, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so why is it? Because you have one person coercing or imposing their will or doing violence to another person, right? So yeah, we'd agree.
Okay, that's not the reason.
Well, what is your reason why murder is wrong? Just curious.
People have we should afford each other a mutual right to life.
Yeah. All right. So, and would you say that having laws on the books to make murder illegal or a punishable crime would be a restriction on individual rights in a sense? Because,
no.
I mean, it is taking away your right to do something. You have a state that's coercing you into not murdering, but to be punished for being a murderer. I mean.
No, because you haven't got the right to murder anyone. There's no ethical right to murder someone, because in doing so, you're effectively violating the right to life by another person.
Yeah, and I would agree, but so would you say that having a state that makes murder illegal, even though because it does restrict on people's quote unquote freedoms. I know you don't consider the freedom to murder a freedom, and I would agree with you, but the idea is that if the state is enforcing laws which impose certain personal restrictions in order to realize the best outcomes for everyone, to enforce the rule that nobody can murder anyone, I mean, would you say that's a preferable outcome than not having a state which does that?
I don't think you need a state to do that, but I would say that is a preferable outcome to a failed state whereby there is no replacement judicial system. Yeah,
gotcha. So there's an equivocation between the anarchist and Marxist definition of a state. Go ahead and define a state for me. Just what's a state? Just make this engaging.
Organization holding a monopoly on force.
All right, cool. Well, as we Marxist-Leninists come to understand it, is the state exists as a tool to facilitate or impose the law of the ruling class. It's a tool of class domination, basically. It's the reason why, it's the reason why cops' response time of police is substantially faster in rich neighborhoods with property-related crimes than it is in poor neighborhoods with violent-related crimes. So the state exists to accommodate the needs of whatever hell economic system is placed, and basically ensure the rule of the ruling class. So I'd say that's the main difference. So,
So it's if it's a specific tool, well, I don't like the word tool because that could mean a range of things, couldn't it? I mean, I'd say then an anarchist society would itself be a state as long as you've got some kind of judicial system. As long as you've got some kind of judicial system regulating some kind of maintaining certain laws of man, then that would be a state in Lenin's definition.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. Anarchists, in a sense, are in favor of a kind of state. It's just, it's more. You guys are in favor of more like a federated system than you are like a central government, from what I understand.
I think there's a range of models for how rights can be protected. Some people advocate a polycentric legal order, where it's deterritorialized and you do it through syndicates, on virtual syndicates. Some people will say no, it will be territorialized, but it just needs to be incredibly democratic and incredibly small. There's a range of models. I'm not exactly sold on either or, but again, when we're talking about a free society, I imagine there'll be a range of models implemented in different parts of different territories, depending on what people are most convinced by and what people find works and where.
Is that it?
Yeah. Well, that's all I've got to say on that point.
All right.
Where were you going with the Leninist definition of the state?
Well, yeah, because there's generally an equivocation on the understanding of what the state is. In a sense, we both kind of share a common goal, which is a stateless society. But the reason why we're in favor of a strong central government is because things like the CIA and imperialism exist that seek to basically destroy literally every possible alternative to liberal capitalism. It's what happened with a lot of the old utopian communes. It's what happened with projects like the CNTFIA. It's what happened with, all of the governments across Latin America. The CIA's basically helped to coup and overthrow 50 different left-wing governments, and that there's a necessity to have a strong central state in order to protect the revolution. And depending on conditions, it might need to be stronger, or it might need to be more decentral. But the reason why actually existing socialism turned out the way that it did was because that they were dictatorships of the proletariat engaged in a protracted struggle against imperialism. So the situation called for it. And it's what I'm concerned with is long-term stability, long-term health of the country, the movement. And that's the reason why I think there needs to be a strong central government, and why we basically need everyone on the same page in a sense. And so far, I haven't really been offered any convincing arguments from your side to the contrary. Yeah, it's true. People who are elected can be corrupt. It's true. Power corrupts. But what we need to look for now in building socialism now is holding that power accountable and making sure that the people in positions of authority that we have in those positions, their material interests are in line with the majority of the general population.
I disagree with the idea that you need a state to defend yourself against imperialism. I think what you need to defend yourself against imperialism would be you need resources, you need personnel, you need vehicles, you need weapons, etc. You don't necessarily. I'm not convinced by the idea that the CNT FAI or the Free Territory Ukraine are examples of anarchism failing because it's doomed to fail. They failed primarily because they didn't have the resources available to them that the fascists had, or the resources available to them that the Soviet Union did. If you swap the geographies, then, as in, if Ukraine was it was the USSR, and then Russia was the anarchist commune, then the anarchists would have won easily in that specific conflict. Same against the CNC.
I disagree. If Russia had its revolution and it was an anarchist revolution, and they went straight to doing what you're ideologically committed to, Russia as we know it today would not currently be a country. I'm 100% convinced of that.
Well, no, it wouldn't be a country.
No, it wouldn't.
I don't want it to be a country.
No, it would be several countries that are neo-colonies to the Western Bloc, or what was left of the remnants of the monarchy and the white Gardists as well, because it would have gotten invaded by 14 countries, and the white Gardists, with the blessing of the British and French, would have came in. And without like everyone being on the same page, without any central leadership, you have no way to guarantee that everyone within your ranks is going to be on the same page, and it's going to get torn apart. Basically, there's no way that revolution would have lasted past the 20s if that were the case.
All right, ThoughtBat, I'm going to give you 3 more minutes to sort of wrap up. I'll give you the final response, just because I had some gentlemen knocking on my door and asked me to please move into question time, and no more besmirching comments about the CIA. Thank you.
Okay. So I acknowledge that in this particular debate, I have not performed particularly well. And that's a fault of my own for many reasons. Probably not enough preparation. I have not been able to answer many questions, important questions that my opponent has brought up. So sadly I apologize for that.
It's okay.
However, I'm still, I don't know, because I don't know where to begin with the critique sometimes, because I feel like I'm just sort of jumping around. I'll yield my time and concede defeat on this.
No worries. Actually, I don't think you lost at all. It was a very interesting discussion. I think all told, this was very worth it. Realizing that I'm breaking from my moderator's role and commenting in that way, but we'll move into questions. We'll try and keep it to about 20 minutes, because I realize you guys are probably both very tired at this point. So let's see. Here we go. This is from Lily Voidtooth. For ThoughtBat, from Lily Voidtooth. For ThoughtBat, do you see the centrally planned economies as being against egoism? If so, why?
Yeah, I do think it's against egoism, because if you've got the necessity of essentially a planned economy to exist would be the imposition of force against people who are also self-interested. So if your interests do not align with the state, then it's not going to be egoistic to support the state, is it? So it does contradict egoism to me.
Thank you very much. And this is for fellow traveler. This is from Noob Slayer. If you say that material conditions will drive a revolution, how would you make sure that during the revolution we don't degrade to fascism and abandon value if you don't use ethics?
Oh, that is an excellent question. That is actually, you got me. In all honesty, I would need a minute to think about that. I mean, I'm not saying that you don't have ethics that drive your ideology and beliefs. I'm simply saying that I don't think ethical arguments are the best arguments to use when it comes to convincing people that you are right. That's all. Otherwise, the way that you take care of fascists is the same way that the Soviets took care of fascists during and before World War II.
All right, and for both of you, I'll let ThoughtBat go first and Trav can go second, unless you prefer to go the other way around. Actually, let's do the other way around. You've been first a lot today, ThoughtBat. So for both, this is again from Noob Slayer. How would you deal with exponential population growth affecting economies on a finite planet? Trav, you first.
Oh, me first? Right. Well, honestly, man, population growth is going to level out. Like the experts on this subject, if you look into it, we're not going to grow exponentially forever. Right now, we're in the middle of an S curve with respect to population growth, because the third and the second worlds are modernizing. And whenever you have modernization of country, you have a boost in the amount of medical technology as well as the abundance of food, so you're able to support more people. And on the other hand, you also have a boost in sex ed and contraception at the same time. So yeah, there's going to be a boost, and the population is going to grow for decades to come, but it's eventually going to, based on most estimates I've seen, it's going to level out around 10.5, 11 billion people by 2100. Because if you look at population growth in the developed world, like the first world, birth rates are like right at or slightly below reproduction rates. Like people are having kids at just at or right below the number of kids the population needs to have to reproduce the entire workforce. So I don't really think it's I think it's a non-issue. It's a non-concern. It's going to slow down. Yeah.
I actually agree with everything fellow traveller said. When you look at birth rates in the West, it seems to me that there's less than 2 children per woman being born. That is a result of alleviating poverty. We typically see if people who are in more middle class backgrounds, from more middle class backgrounds, they have fewer kids. So it seems to me that solving poverty and increasing the general living standards of any community is going to be the answer to mitigating any problems concerning population increases.
Thank you very much. This is from Gordozin. For both, thoughts on religious socialism. Who wants to go first?
I've talked enough. You can keep talking. Thought that.
Religious socialism, I suppose it exists, and I suppose there's no contradictions between socialism and any kind of religion. I care more about the policy positions of any religious socialist. Obviously, Leo Tolstoy was an anarchist, and he was also a Christian. I would make an anti-theist argument in general, because I think religion is inauthentic, and I think you need to be authentic. You need to act according to your actual value judgments with a certain freedom of thought. But I think that's another conversation entirely.
Yeah. So what I'm going to say is I'll take religious socialism over religious liberalism or fascism any day. The reason why I think the repression of religious ideology is justified to an extent during revolutionary situations is because, you name a revolution, you name, hell, even a reformist movement, you name any sort of like push for progress whatsoever historically, and it's been the men of the cloth who've been against it at almost every turn. But on the other hand, there are also different forms of on the other hand, you also have religious socialists. You have like liberation gospel. You have a lot of quotes you can take from Jesus that are very pro-majority, pro-socialist in nature, like his quote where he says that you basically can't go to heaven if you're rich. So I am more than happy for socialists to basically co-opt religious ideology in the superstructure because it helps undermine capitalism in the long term. I don't believe in banning religion outright, but and I don't believe in a system of state atheism either. I'm in favor of a secular state, but yeah, no, we got to keep a tight eye on the men of the cloth during and after the revolution.
Thank you very much. And this is from Gemini Gizmo to ThoughtBat. What do you think about a decentralized planned economy?
I've got no objections to a decentralized planned economy, so long as no principled objections, so long as such planning is done voluntarily and voluntarily. I've lost my words now. So I think we're talking about anarcho-communism, anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism even, and these would be alternative models to markets, socialism or mutualism that kind of coexist within a mutualist, within an anarchist territory. So I think the reason I say I'm a mutualist is because I predict that that cooperative enterprise and mutual exchange will be the more dominant medium of resource distribution across large areas of territory in also more largely populated areas. I think there are limitations as far as anarcho-communism is concerned. If you scale it up to anything above a few thousand, I think you're going to have a reintroduction of markets from somewhere. This happens in Christiania. I've been there, had a lovely English breakfast there. So there's no principled objection to it. Anarcho-communists are my political allies, but I think markets will be a feature even in like large anarcho-communist communities.
Thank you very much. And this one's for Trav from Lord Pastor Productions. My issue with planned economies is a lack of property norms to reify the economic structure without a large state. Within what bounds can people have rights over things in planned economies?
I don't completely understand the question. I apologize. Could you repeat it for me?
Sure. I think the latter part is really the main part of the question. Within what bounds can people have rights over things in planned economies? I take him to mean, to what extent do people have, I would say, like absolute personal rights over things in planned economies?
Yeah. So you would have a socialist constitution. Everyone would still have property rights. Like your personal belongings are still yours. Like nobody wants to collectivize your iPhone or whatever, like, or your cars. What we want to collectivize are the tools used to produce your iPhones and cars. These should be public property, and they should be producing towards a common good for all. You would have a socialist constitution that, on one hand, when it comes to the means of production themselves, would say these are basically the common heritage to everyone in the country. It's all public property. But on the other hand, if you've got, some land, like if you own a few acres, you should be allowed to own some acres. You should be allowed to own some tools. If you want to be self-employed, I'm not saying that you can't be self-employed. If you want to work in a small cooperative, that's fine too. It's really like labor exploitation that's going to be outlawed, So like you can't extract surplus value from other people or collect rents, dividends, intellectual property. These are things I want directly abolished. But no, under socialism, you'd still have a house, you'd still have your phone and your tools and all the personal belongings you do now. It's just no one would be able to own factories anymore. It would be everyone's property.
Thank you very much. We'll do 2 more questions, one for each of you. So ThoughtBat, this is by, here we go. Sorry, this is by Hasbug. Do you have any specifics for how mutual aid will deal with unemployment?
So in terms of dealing with unemployment, so mutual aid is a very, very vague term. It includes a wide variety of issues. Mutual aid could be literally helping people establish a business, or it could be giving people career advice. It could be helping mitigate the consequences of unemployment, as fellow traveler brought up before. So it really depends on what specific type of mutual aid you're talking about. So you would end up having some kind of maybe resource distribution from cooperatives, helping people who are unemployed out, because I do not believe a community which has people being unable to pay for things is actually a good thing or a good place to live in. Or you could have just people going out and helping others set up businesses themselves, with financially, perhaps, with advice, perhaps. It depends. There's a wide range of things I could do.
All right, I'm just trying to find quickly a last question for Trav. Okay, here we go. So for fellow traveler, this is from Noob Slayer. How would you determine what is needed in a planned economy? How would you determine what can be allowed to be produced in a planned economy?
You would do so with inputs. Basically, you would look at the consumption rates or the consumption habits during the year. You would do surveys, figuring out how much milk does the population consume, how much oil do we need, coal, whatever, and you would just take inventory of all of these inputs. It's going to be a lot of inputs that you would be taking inventory of, and then from there, you would basically be calculating how much time plus the amount of time from variable and constant capital together it would take on average to produce however many units of each different input. And then for the stuff that's more scarce, you'd be distributing according to work. For things that you could produce in a relative abundance rather cheaply, you could distribute more towards need. But that's the general idea, basically, is how you would do it. You just take inventory, you would take surveys, you would have people making requests to planners with an idea of XYZ product. You could also use open source for designing products. I'm a big fan of open source. It's some software I'm very much about, but there's a multitude of ways you could do it. This is just a general outline or idea of what I think should be done. I hope that's satisfactory.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, there is one more question for both of you, if you would be fine with that, because we have 5 more minutes. Actually, as it turns out, I thought we'd be a little bit more pressed for time. And this is by Gemini Gizmo. For both, what are your thoughts on council communism? And either of you can go first, doesn't matter.
Hold on a second.
Right,
I honestly don't know anything about it. I wish I could give input on it, but I know very little about council communism theory and practice. So forgive me for my lack of response.
Same boat. I've got a little bit of understanding. I've heard the word before, and I've Googled the definition. It seems to me that council communism is a system whereby you effectively have a Rojavan kind of setup. So there's still a state, but it's very local, and it's very much it claims to be libertarian. It's like a libertarian version of Marxism or communism. But my opinions of it, I still say, well, as it's being a state, it's still a monopoly on force. It's still going to effectively be its own bureaucracy. It's still going to be imposing its will, violating workplace democracy, people's rights to use of property, etc. So yeah, it might be better than, well, it might be a better alternative to what we have now. But I think I'd still be trying to advocate for anarchism anyways.
All right, well, thank you very much to both of you. This is a very interesting and positive discussion, which is really what we're going for with this. The ideal for me is that it turns into a discussion and not just a bloodbath, as you usually see on a lot of these debate channels. So I'm quite happy with how this turned out. Would you guys like to plug your channels before we conclude?
Sure. Name spelled Traveler. I do Marxist-Leninist communist content. I do political commentary every weekend. I produce a lot of response videos, video essays. The general goal of my channel is just education, radicalization, education. Basically, explain the truth about socialism, communism, get people radicalized. That's the primary goal of my channel.
Thank you very much. And ThoughtBat.
ThoughtBat is a anarchist egoist YouTube channel. I got my inspiration from watching Hakim's videos, saying and thinking to myself, we need an anarchist version of this. So it delves into anarchist theory. I give my ethical explanations for certain things. Actually, I try away from response videos, even though my most successful video is a response video. But I think, especially after this debate, I think I might be focusing on video essayist. I don't have a particular schedule. Because this is something I do in my spare time. It's more of an amateur thing. ThoughtBat will never be monetized because I disagree with the monetization of ideologies. Well, the commodification of ideologies, actually. Funny thing to say from a market socialist. But if you're interested in anarchist theory, or you think anarchists should be more theory-oriented, come and subscribe to ThoughtBat.
As someone who is monetized, you're not missing out, trust me.
Yeah, ain't that the truth?
So thanks everybody for participating. This was really good. If anybody in the audience would like to participate in a future Sunday Showdown or knows somebody who should participate in a future Sunday Showdown, reach out to me on Twitter or on Discord. There's a link in the description. And thank you to ThoughtBat and fellow Traveler for the very interesting discussion. You guys have a good evening.
Thank you.
You.
You too.
And take care, everybody.